Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Associate Counsel at the Freedom from Religion Foundation here in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mark Dan, Director of Governmental Affairs at FFRF in Washington, D.C. With us today is Jen Bendery, a senior politics reporter for the Huffington Post. She's covered Congress, the courts, and the White House for the Huffington Post since 2011. She previously reported on Congress for 4 years for Roll Call, a Capitol Hill newspaper, and spent 4 years covering the Texas legislature for Gallery Watch in Austin. Jen can be found on Twitter at jbendery. We had Jen on the show earlier this year, but due to technical difficulties, a lot of her ideas were unable to be expressed. We're honored that Jen has come back to Ask an Atheist. She'll talk about what we can expect from the Biden administration with court reform and judicial nominees, and how we can overcome Trump's judicial legacy. One of our favorite things about Jen is she is an agnostic who feels very at peace in nature.
And as always, if you have questions for Jen or us, ask them in the Facebook comments, or you can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Remember, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization, so we happily accept donations. And we do not and cannot take sides in partisan elections, don't necessarily endorse any partisan views that might be expressed here. But of course, the topic is somewhat political. We're talking about judicial appointments and, of course, the potential for court reform. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we talked about in our previous show with Jen, and hopefully get to hear some of what Jen's perspective is on these issues. But like a lot of organizations last year, FFRF published a report in December discussing the threat to secular government that's facing us thanks to the court packing that was done over the past 4 years in the previous administration with ultra-conservative judges. You can still check out our report at ffrf.us/judges. That will pull up our report on Christian nationalism in the judiciary and the massive threat that's posed by just how many judges were appointed and rammed onto the federal courts from the district courts all the way up to the 3 judges that were put on the Supreme Court. So we're talking to Jen about that problem and the potential solutions. She's been covering the courts for years and politics as well. Mark, I don't know if you want to ask your first question. Some of this is repetitive from last time, but Jen, just give us your thoughts since we didn't quite get them last time.
All right, yeah, and there's plus a lot of ground to cover. Here in Washington, it has been a very active few months, which kind of gets to the whole point of it, of what we're discussing today, which is undoing Christian nationalism in the courts. So, Jen, you've been covering the courts for years. It has been a wild 6 months. We saw the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation, Trump's last-minute push to secure more lifetime judges, the election of Biden and Harris, the January 6th attack, and now we're awaiting Biden's first slate of judicial nominees. How are we going to describe this to future generations without them thinking we're absolutely crazy?
Well, there's a lot you just packed into those last several months, and there's different things happening there. I mean, a lot of activity happened with the courts, and then separately there was this whole insurrection at the United States Capitol, and there was some overlap there with timing, but in my mind, those are so. In some way, they are all connected, actually. But it's been a rough go in D.C. I can say that people are still reeling from the insurrection. I mean, people who don't live in D.C. watched it on TV and saw how awful it was, and then time moves on. Trump has left. Biden and Harris are back. Not back. They're in the White House, and things are moving on a different track. But we still have all the same Republicans in Congress who basically enabled the president to get to that point. And they're moving forward as if that didn't happen. And it's, to me, is underlying everything that we do in this Congress now, is that we must not forget that there are 147 Republicans currently in Congress who voted to overturn the election after the Capitol insurrection. That must, to me, as one reporter, that has to underscore everything that we report on in DC. When these people cast votes or give floor speeches, they actually voted to undermine democracy right after an insurrection. So we can't just move on from that. And I hope that we don't, as a media at large, and we factor that into everything that we do, whether it's votes on judges votes on legislation, floor speeches. We cannot separate any of it from what we just witnessed. That said, on the courts, yes, there was also a lot happening. You saw after Trump lost a mad dash by Republicans to just push through whoever, as many judges as they could. We all watched as RBG passed away, and then Mitch McConnell, who was then the Senate Majority Leader, raced through to get Amy Coney Barrett confirmed, which was a complete 180 on his previous stance that you shouldn't confirm a Supreme Court nominee in a presidential election year. And this was just weeks away from the election. So that was a total flip-flop by Mitch McConnell and the entire Senate Republican Party. So that all happened. And by the end of Trump's term, we saw a record number of judges confirmed. Just incredible quantity on the Supreme Court. Of course, I think, did Trump get 3? I honestly can't even remember anymore. Is it 2, 3?
3.
It doesn't matter
3.
Because he got so many more on the U.S. appeals courts, and then he got even more on district courts. So there was a huge push for years by Mitch McConnell and the Federalist Society, with Trump essentially as their pawn, to get these people through. It was decades in the making moment. That is over now. We have the Biden administration in office, and you can expect something very, very different in terms of the direction of where Biden will be going with the courts.
So that's like a perfect jumping off point to sort of talk about. I can't remember when we last had you on, and when we were talking about, I think we were sort of like prognosticating about the new administration. Maybe it was January or so. But we're like 50 some odd days into the new administration. There's all this urgency from progressives and people like us who care about, secular laws and democracy. What are you seeing and hearing on the Hill and in the Biden administration about progress towards filling seats? We know that there was all this urgency towards this after the courts were packed and continued during the lame duck session. Like, what are you hearing about, the sort of what the Biden administration is doing to combat that with just appointments? What do we know about the Commission on Court Reform? Like, what's moving in these first 50 days?
Essentially, nothing is moving right now, but that's only on the front end. There's a lot of movement happening on the back end, and by the back end, I mean there's a lot of vetting going on at the White House. There's a lot of vetting going on through the Department of Justice of judicial nominees, and it can feel a bit like, okay, there was such an urgency to flipping back the courts, from the direction that Trump took them in, in the context of what Democrats want to see. And so you have this mad dash by Republicans to fill as many seats. Trump is gone. They did their deeds on the courts. Biden's in. Democrats control the Senate. This is their window. So there is this kind of sense of like, hurry up and wait. Like, people are a little bit anxious. And by people, I mean progressive groups are anxious to see judicial nominees start getting announced, start getting hearings, start moving through the system, to start to see that Biden is actually going to do something tangible to push back on all this, the sometimes like totally unacceptable judicial nominees that Trump put through. But here we are in late March, and it can feel like it's been a very long time of waiting. But in fact, Biden is not behind schedule if you want to compare him to where past presidents were at this time in their presidency in terms of putting forward the first batch of judicial nominees. That said, there's been a lot of background activity happening, and I think that Biden is expected to announce either one or his first batch of judicial picks pretty soon. And the White House has been pretty quiet about the timing of what they're doing, or which courts they're looking at filling first, or if they want to make a statement with the first nominees that they put forward, which you would think that they would want to do to kind of their entree into the judicial nominations process, make a big splash, have some really historic nominees. But for the moment, there's no one coming through that I know of. And the bar was essentially defined to me by some people who talked to the White House, was that Biden wanted to wait, to get this COVID relief package through Congress. That was the big priority at first. So that happened. Mm-hmm. So then the next thing was he wanted to get his cabinet secretaries confirmed. So I think, I could be wrong, but I think we may have just finished that. We've got deputy level cabinet picks coming through now, but there may be 1 or 2 potential cabinet picks left, but I think we've just gone through the vast majority of them, if not all of them. So that means that we can expect Biden to start putting forward judicial nominees any day now. I just don't know when. I don't think anybody knows when exactly. And there's just a lot of anticipation because people want to see something happening after what we all witnessed from the last 4 years, which was a drastic push to the right on the U.S. courts, on all levels of federal courts. And progressives in particular are just eager to see a total shift in the people we're putting on courts and to see a real diversity of nominees, which Trump absolutely did not have. He had a lot of white men who are young and conservative and had very ideological views about women's bodies and abortion rights and gay rights and all the things. So there's a lot of anticipation right now. There's not any visible movement yet, but I think something is going to be happening. I mean, it sounds to me like in the next week or so.
So I know you've covered this, Jen, and I've been reading a little bit about the push for diversity, and me as a lawyer, this is of interest to me, and I'm a public sector lawyer. You know, one of the things we know about most of Trump's judicial nominees and appointments is that they were overwhelmingly male, they were overwhelmingly white. But one of the things that is less talked about is that they overwhelmingly come through the legal and up through the legal profession through kind of one walk of life, which is, private sector, traditional legal jobs, which means they're not often from the ranks of public defenders and public sector lawyers, people that work for civil rights organizations like the ACLU and the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And so can you talk about sort of the push for diversity of professional diversity within the bench and whether and how that can be balanced with sort of the urgency to get these seats filled?
So is this your bid to make yourself available?
Yes, I would like to say
that's where this is actually headed. Okay.
Yes, it's important to note that I am ready to assume a seat on the federal bench.
You're ready to be an appeals court judge.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually do kind of fit the bill for what Biden claims to want. And you're right. There's a lot of different ways of defining diversity of judicial nominees. And typically, Democrats have sort of talked about it in terms of race or gender or, I don't know, like religion, the kind of like the social context of defining a person. But professional diversity has really not gotten much attention until very recently. And by professional diversity, to your point, it's this idea that you don't only have corporate lawyers be picked to be lifetime judges. And whether you want to look at Trump's judicial nominees, you can say all kinds of things about, but there was one relative constant with his nominees and even Obama's nominees is that most of them were corporate lawyers. And so it's not as if Obama was a big champion on professional diversity either. He was very good he made a lot of historic judicial confirmations in terms of nominating Black women or Asian judges for the first time ever on a certain bench, or the number of women in general that he put through, or LGBTQ judges. I mean, he had all kinds of firsts with his judicial nominations in the context of race and gender and religion. But things like professional diversity are just really painfully absent from the federal bench. So Biden has come into office claiming that this is something he really cares about. And it appears to be more than just talk, because I got a hold of a letter back in December from his White House lead counsel that went to every Democratic senator, essentially saying, all right, guys, you need to hurry up and send us judicial recommendations now, because we want to have these all queued up and ready to go. This is December. We want to have our people ready to go in January after Biden's sworn in. We want to have people in the queue to start moving forward with. And P.S., one thing we really want you to do as senators who have a huge role in picking who judges are, we want people with backgrounds that are not just corporate lawyers. We want people who are public defenders. We want people who are civil rights attorneys. We don't want people who are from Ivy League schools necessarily. We want people who are just diverse in backgrounds, because that's the kind of diversity you want reflected in the courts that hear from our diverse population. And we just don't have that. So I think, as someone who covers the courts and judicial nominees in particular, the idea that professional diversity is actually gaining traction is a huge deal. You don't hear Democrats championing this hardly ever. The only senator who I've heard ever pushing for this was Elizabeth Warren. And that was years ago. And she even went out on a limb and dinged President Obama at the time for not doing enough on this front. And I actually ran into Elizabeth Warren yesterday in the Senate, and I brought it up, and she was late to a hearing or a meeting. Her aide was tugging her arm, they had to go. But I mentioned that I was working on a story about professional diversity among judicial nominees, which might sound super boring to the layman, but to Elizabeth Warren, she was like, whoa. And she made her aide sit there stressed out and let her talk to me for like at least 10 minutes, pretty effusively, about why this needs to be a bigger issue, about how she's been talking to the White House about it, about how she's personally talked to senators about the need to recommend judicial nominees to the White House that are women of color, that are women or people who have backgrounds in human rights law and civil rights law, people who went to state school. And it might not sound like that's that complicated, but if you were to spend the time going through all of our federal judges and looking at their backgrounds, absolutely, by and large, the vast majority went to Ivy League schools and have corporate law backgrounds. And so the idea is we're going to move away from that under Obama. And I actually think it's not just talk. And that is like pretty exciting for someone who cares about this stuff.
Yeah, that's actually really encouraging. And just coming from the, the public sector lawyers' experience, it's like, what are we talking about when we talk about a non-corporate lawyer? And it's really, there's so much diversity in terms of what your life experience can be, obviously. But even as a lawyer, what your life experience can be is so vastly different. There are so many different ways to be a lawyer. And when you're coming from a public defender background or a civil servant background or a government lawyer background, you are interacting with clients, individual human beings, people whose needs are really different, who interact with the legal system in very different ways at different times. And it just gives you a perspective that you don't think of, when you think of lawyer, judge, you don't realize how much can potentially be missing if someone was following a one-track, corporate law, Ivy League school, corporate law, judgeship path. You don't necessarily want that same profile of person deciding every single, thing that affects all of our lives.
No, and I think it's important for people to understand why this stuff matters, because talk about the courts can feel so dry and boring and removed from our regular lives. But, the thing to keep in mind is that, federal judges are often the last say in, especially on the appeals courts, they're often the last say in a federal court case. They're the last landing place for a federal case, by and large. In other words, let's think about the number of cases that the Supreme Court hears, which we always talk about, versus appeals courts. The key is that U.S. appeals courts resolve 50,000 cases a year, roughly. That's compared to about 100 cases resolved by the Supreme Court every year. So that's the last spot, that's kind of the last stage of most federal cases, is the appeals courts. And so if you're going to have a consistent bench of, by and large, white male corporate lawyers who, particularly under the Trump administration, have backgrounds that are very hardline, ideological, right-wing, extreme, and then you put into, then you consider the fact that this is the last, oftentimes the final say in a federal court case. That tells you who's deciding the laws of our land.
Yeah,
and
it matters.
It does matter. And the concern is that people who don't have a diversity of backgrounds, they're not familiar with the legal needs of everyday people who maybe they're living with low incomes, or you're otherwise marginalized in your community based on, you're a minority, or you're in a socioeconomic status that is, not rich and white. So the idea that you would have judges that have backgrounds in civil rights or in working with low-income families, they would actually understand and relate to the people who come before them, which is the whole point, is you want judges to reflect the people who come before them. And we don't have that in the context of the professional diversity. We have Ivy League white men, by and large.
Well, it's encouraging that that's being really seriously prioritized by the new administration. Mark, I want to kick it to you. We're already 20 minutes in. Do you have any kind of Hill perspective questions that you wanted to ask Jen about the courts and where we're at?
A lot of them. Jen, you talked a lot in your introduction about the January 6th attack, and also that the face of the courts more so are straight white Christian men who, especially from the Trump administration, from very conservative backgrounds. So do you think there's a connection between the January 6th attack and the push from the Trump administration and McConnell to get a certain type of judge onto the bench and what they're doing about it?
I mean, I think I can't say yes, that like there's a connection to all the judges on the courts from Trump and a bunch of white supremacists violently attacking the Capitol to kill lawmakers to prevent them from certifying an election. I mean, it's just so complicated on what brought us to that moment. But I think that if there is a thread, it's that for starters, Trump himself did not care really about anything from a policy standpoint. He wanted people to like him, and he wanted to be able to say he won things. So that's all he really cared about, was winning, right? So he won on the courts in his mind. Mitch McConnell funneled through all of his nominees. The Federalist Society gave him nominees. He was just a pawn, essentially. He did not care or know about any of his judges that were confirmed on his watch. Let's just be clear about that. So if he doesn't care about anything except winning, he won the courts, and that will be one of his continued talking points. Is like, I look what I did to the courts. I redid the courts. He also only cared about winning re-election, and he didn't. And he lied and lied and lied about the election being stolen and spreading lies about that. And so the misinformation about the election and Trump's general disposition about just lying to make himself look like a winner, that is the only thread in this moment I can see beyond the ideological extremism of some of Trump's judicial nominees. But I'm not going to say that his judicial nominees are aligned with the insurrectionists, or that the insurrectionists were guided by the same thing that is guiding Trump's judicial nominees. They both have serious problems with what was going on with their thinking, in terms of why would people attack the Capitol building and try to kill lawmakers? And separately, why would judicial nominees be put onto the federal bench who think that abortion is like slavery, or, that transgender people are the devil? I mean, so there's extremism in both camps, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. There's extremism in both camps, but you can't really connect a literal insurrection with, some ideologically extreme judicial nominees who were not there attacking the Capitol.
Yeah. And I think important to point out, I mean, I'm not handing out like courage medals or anything, but important to point out that every single federal judge that heard one of these like completely fiction-based lawsuits about election fraud during the post-election period found them to be baseless, including conservative appointees and Trump appointees. So,
I mean, that's true. And that shows you that there is some limit. I mean, there was like zero evidence for any of Trump's lawsuits. So it was something like 65 cases or more that went to court about the election, that every single one of them was struck down by federal judges of all, political persuasions. There's simply no evidence of anything. So there's that. But there's also this idea, and this is probably a broader point to make about judges, is that sometimes when a judicial nominee goes through the process and they seem particularly extreme and ideological and perhaps worrisome to you, if you are, let's say, a progressive Democrat and you see a very right-wing ideological judge being put into a lifetime court seat, sometimes what happens is judges hit the bench, they're done with the process, they're in their seat for life, and they care more about adhering to law and being a fair-minded judge than perhaps their background would make you think that they would. There's a certain, and I'm saying this not as a judge, I'm not a judge, but I have talked to federal judges about this. And there's this idea that for many people who are put onto the federal bench, you take it seriously. And you're not just there to be like a political hack, with a partisan agenda. You actually you take a vow and you care about following the law. So there's that. And that's important to consider when looking at any judicial nominees. But that said, of course, every judge brings their own experiences and their own perspective to interpreting the law, and law is going to be interpreted. So it's kind of a mix of those two things that are important to keep in mind with judges, that of course no judge is totally objective, and law is not hard and fast. And, there's going to be interpretation of law based on your perspective. But at the same time, judges are proud to be judges, and they take pride in it, and they want to carry out a fair lawsuit, or oversee a fair case and feel like they are contributing to the greater good in some sense. So all this to say, you have to always factor in those two pieces when looking at judges, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, and sorry, Mark, I'm just saying the whole point of lifetime appointments was to remove some of the political dimension from what judges are asked to do. And so the fact that that effect can be minimally detected at times is good. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that is a good reason to be optimistic. One of the cases that we're looking at that could be coming down very soon would be the Fulton decision, which could grant vast religious exemptions. So naturally, we are watching that case and that development extremely closely. So do you think there is reason to be nervous about it, or do you think the judges might follow precedent and follow their instructions a little bit on that, given what you're seeing kind of the mood on the federal bench?
Well, it depends on what court that case is going to, and I'll be honest, I don't know very much about this case. But it depends on what court this lawsuit is going to, who the judges are. Is this at the district level right now, or is it at an appeals court level?
Supreme.
Oh, this is Supreme. My bad.
They just heard oral argument on it this year, and I think reports from the oral arguments were not encouraging for, if you like civil rights.
If we're talking about, I see. So if we're talking about the Supreme Court, makes it much more unique because we all know who's on the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court. I mean, we can all see the makeup of the Supreme Court. It's leaning conservative pretty heavily. So at this point, I don't know the details of this case, this lawsuit, but if you consider that, I guess 6 out of the 3 on there, or at least 5 out of the, 6 out of the 9, or at least 5 out of the 9 are pretty reliably going to lean to the right, then this court is particularly tipped to the right. So I think the Supreme Court, generally speaking, is a little bit easier to see how they're going to rule on things.
I agree, and it's really discouraging.
And you don't have to be a legal expert.
Right. So Fulton is a case that, just while we're talking about it for people who are watching, is a case that has to do with the rights of Christian-based, religious-based adoption agencies to discriminate against same-sex parents who want to adopt. And so that made its way through the federal courts out of Pennsylvania, I think, and Supreme Court just heard oral arguments on it. And unfortunately, I do think it is going to probably come out in a way that is not good for civil rights expansion or children. But
I would tend to agree with you on that. And it's not that hard to see on a case like this when you consider that most of the judges on the Supreme Court are members of the Federalist Society, which continues to be an overlooked aspect to so many of our judges. And what that means is that at the core of these particular justices' belief systems is the idea that religious freedom is of utmost importance, and that LGBT rights are not, that women's rights are not, that women's bodies are not considered under the full control of women. So we already know this. We know this. The Federalist Society justices have a pretty core belief system that they are adhering to. And in the case of religious freedom, they feel pretty strongly about it in almost every context.
Right.
Yay!
Well, if you have questions for Jen Bendery from the Huffington Post, ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Jen, there's a growing chorus for the need of judicial reform, from expanding the number of lower court seats to even expanding the number of Supreme Court seats. What are you hearing from the Hill and the Biden administration on court reform?
So I think for all the talk during the presidential election about expanding the Supreme Court, that was sort of a very lofty goal among progressives and judicial activists. And I think that Biden's commission is looking at this. But I think in reality, that is much more of a talking point. It's more of a concept right now than something that we can expect to happen anytime soon, if at all. Adding seats to the Supreme Court would be a pretty big deal. And I don't think that this Senate has it in it to do that. It's so close in there. They don't even want to mess with the filibuster, really. I mean, they're starting to come around on it, but expanding seats on the Supreme Court, I think, is a bit too far for a number of senators. However, I think that, I know that there are senators in both parties and in the House to pass a bill, or members in the House to pass a bill that would expand the number of court seats on the lower courts, on different district courts, on different appeals courts. And the reason it's bipartisan is because there are courts in senators and member states in both parties that are woefully overworked, and they're very clearly understaffed, and their workloads are almost unmanageable, if not unmanageable, and they just simply need more seats. I mean, it's not hard to see,
right,
if you dig into the data. So it's not, everything doesn't have to be partisan. I mean, at least that's the hope. And in this case, it's a matter of pragmatism, that certain courts are absolutely drowning and they need help, and they haven't added seats to the lower courts in a long time, systematically. So, I think it was even last fall that Senator Todd Young from Indiana introduced a bill to add more seats to the courts, which he's a Republican. So this is not just a blue versus red fight about courts and making everything Democratic or everything Republican. It's a matter of having our judicial system function.
Right.
And some courts are absolutely not functioning well enough right now because they're just so swamped. So I think the chances for expanding seats on lower courts are actually decent. I mean, the fact that a Republican senator introduced the bill in the fall, when it wasn't even, I don't even know why he did that when he did. It was like right around the election. Like, it's not going to become law last year, but it shows that someone's willing to throw that down, a Republican senator, and it's not just for kicks. It's like, that's a thing that both parties could absolutely get on board with.
Right. It's so politicized, and you forget that these are actual courts with caseloads, and there's a huge administrative piece to this. And I think you were talking about how long it's been since the seats can only be expanded by Congress, and I want to say it was the 80s, or at least that's when the last time another circuit was added. So, and we know as a organization that files federal lawsuits, it routinely takes 3 to 8 years for a civil lawsuit to, work its way through the federal courts. And sometimes it can take, half a dozen years where you're, in different phases of a federal lawsuit just at the district court level. And a lot of that is just because of clogged dockets and how far things get set out. And when they're civil cases and they can be pushed back, they are. And that's administrative. I mean, there's nothing political about that. So,
and I think in our hyper politicized country right now, there's real people working on courts, and there's real people who go before courts, and it's a third branch of government. It's sort of like the ugly stepchild of the three branches. Like, people talk about the White House and who the president is, and people know about Congress and they're passing their laws. But there's also the judicial branch of government. It's a whole branch by itself, and it hasn't been completely politicized at this point, and it has to function, and I think, especially maybe it's because I live in Washington, D.C., and people tend to throw everything through a political lens, but it's true that we need our courts to work. That's not partisan. And when they're very clearly struggling to keep up with the amount of work that they have, it's just not partisan. It's like, Republicans and Democrats in Congress who go home are hearing from constituents who are like, I'm being discriminated against at work. I'm going to sue my boss, and I'm not going to have my hearing resolved for 3 years. Like, I'm being discriminated against right now. So what am I supposed to do for 3 years? I mean, it's just, there's so many cases where you can't, justice has to happen like now.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of reasons why I can see members of Congress in both parties supporting something like this in the next year or two.
So time is flying here, Mark. So is it okay if I check for audience questions real quick?
Go for it. Yeah.
Here's kind of an interesting one, and I'm curious if you have an answer for this, Jen. I don't know how closely you follow the actual Supreme Court docket, but a question from a Facebook commenter, Joshi, is what do you think the most important case the Supreme Court will rule on in the next year is going to be? Do you have any thoughts on, or even just kind of chatter on what is going to be a really big watched case coming from the Supreme Court in the next year?
I can't really point to one case because I don't know what they're looking at right now. But more broadly speaking, I think that because of the way the court is leaning right now, as of Amy Coney Barrett joining the court last fall, you can bet that conservatives are going to be racing to push issues through the court system to get to the Supreme Court right now, to get their perspective reflected in the court decisions. So anything to do with abortion rights, anything to do with same-sex marriage, with anything to do with gun control and gun safety. Think of all the issues that Democrats tend to care about. Those are the issues that conservatives will be lobbying and filing lawsuits on specifically to try to get them all the way up to the Supreme Court to get them ruled on now.
Right.
So I can't point to a specific case, but I think it's important to think about what do conservatives really want the Supreme Court to weigh in on right now, given how conservative the court is. Those are the issues that you should be watching right now, because who knows when the next Supreme Court justice is going to step down. A lot of them are pretty old. There's a lot of talk about Justice Breyer. He's up there, and how some Democrats are like, okay, like you need to go, let Biden replace you. But you've also got Clarence Thomas, for example, and there was a lot of rumors about him stepping down last year, and that didn't happen. And he said it wasn't true, but you never know what's true with justices and when they step down. So if for anyone watching the court right now, I think if you care about some of the issues that Democrats as a party tend to care about, those are the issues that are going to be challenged actively right now.
I mean, we know this. This has become, quiet part out loud. This is like the least surprising thing ever. But you have state lawmakers that are still passing these more and more restrictive abortion bans at the state level that are just openly saying in the legislative, record that these are aimed at the Supreme Court. They're aimed at Roe versus Wade. These 5-week abortion bans and things like that are being passed in state legislatures in more than one state. Legislators are speaking up saying, we want the Supreme Court to take up our law. We want to have this law be the one that overturns or eviscerates Roe versus Wade. So we know that these big cultural hot button issues are being aimed right at the 6-3 court right now. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but you can't overlook the role that Amy Coney Barrett is going to have. She's the most recent justice, and in her former roles, during her confirmation hearing, it came up a lot that she has suggested that Roe versus Wade was an erroneous decision in the past. And she also called the Affordable Care Act's birth control benefit an assault on religious liberty. So that's just a couple of examples of her thinking. That was back before she had to say she didn't have opinions on anything when she had her Supreme Court confirmation hearing. So the best people can do is look at what a Supreme Court nominee has said in the past, because they will not reveal anything in their confirmation hearing. And so I think anything related to abortion and religious liberty that is what conservatives are looking at right now. Amy Coney Barrett is they just cemented their support for basically challenging and attacking anything to do with abortion rights under the guise of religious freedom and liberty. Right. There's a question here that's probably not quite for Jen, but I do want to ask it so I can answer it, which is, does FFRF plan on creating an easy to find database to see which judges in our areas are not treating people equally on the basis of religion, so that we can pressure lawmakers to approve less biased judges? I just want to point out that at the page where we are housing our report, we also plan to, as judges are being proposed and appointed, and that's again at FFRF.org/judges. FFRF.us/judges. You can find it. You're looking at our regular URL, which is FFRF.org. You can find it if you kind of go spelunking there, but you can get to it directly at FFRF.us/judges. You'll see our report, and then in the months to come, we are planning to kind of update and kind of comment and blog a little bit about who's being put forth as new nominees, what's changing about the makeup of the courts, and hopefully people can kind of keep up with who's being named, who's being appointed, who's being voted on, and we want the public to be really engaged and getting good information about the federal courts, because it's been this kind of dormant issue that has, been this sleeping giant of conservative plotting, and now it's just this existential issue to anything that progressives want to get done that will have to survive the federal courts. So check that out at FFRF.us/judges, and hopefully we will have some kind of updates to add soon as the Biden administration gets going with appointees. And I'm looking through other questions. Dan Barker upstairs of FFRF, co-president, wants to know, Mark, Dan, about the artwork behind you, which we all have already asked you about off the air.
So my husband and I, we went on a trip to Senegal, and we found these really great mosaic fabric paintings. So what this is a lot of fabrics that are put together from a lot of women's clothing, and whether it's scarves or dresses, and just a lot of the fashion that people wear in Senegal is very dynamic, and it's very bold, and it makes a pretty good wall space. And Jen, as we were kind of turning to how the Senate is changing a lot this year, or in some cases maintaining the same, just in different areas, firebrand senators like Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, and Tom Cotton are on Senate Judiciary Committee and have fairly prominent platforms now to talk about their views and their ideas. What are you hearing from the Hill, from staffers and members, about how this dynamic is affecting the committee?
Well, I should say I'm not hearing anything specifically from people on the Hill about these senators, but I think it's fairly self-evident what's going on, which is all three of those senators are in the minority, and all three of those senators are very likely going to be running for president in 2024, which means they will be using their role on the committee to grandstand and to make big statements and to pull to the right to try to outright each other. I mean, in some sense, that will be really interesting to watch the three of them go at it with each other, because they want to look like the most Trumpy senators that they can to try to win over Trump's base of supporters in a couple of years. So I fully expect them to politicize the Judiciary Committee hearings as much as possible, solely with the presidential election of 2024. Otherwise, I mean, they're in the minority. The three of them are already kind of media hogs. They like to make big splashes with very extreme and sometimes offensive comments, but that appease some Trump supporters. So I don't expect anything different from them on this committee. I mean, they've already been mostly like that, but you've got the three of them on there now. I don't expect them to really, act in good faith, to ask questions of many judicial nominees. They are simply Biden nominees that they do not want to be seen supporting, and will probably vote no on all of them, unless they are nominees from their own states that they agreed to in advance with the White House, which I also am not sure how that's going to work, because it's just become so partisan in there. There's all kinds of ways they could not work with the White House to put forward any nominees to try to prevent Biden from filling any seats in their states. So that's a whole other can of worms. But all this to say, I think they're going to be very political on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I expect very little good faith work from them on the committee to actually weigh and vote out judges that they think are good judges.
So just to tie it up, Jen, on filling open seats, are we both on the Judiciary Committee and in the larger Senate? Are we just majority rules here? Is it going to be 50-50? So is it just a matter of waiting for the Biden administration to, drop these nominees and then it's go time? Or what can we expect once we actually see some nominees and a list of candidates drop to the Senate?
Well, once Biden finally does announce some judicial nominees, I think a lot of people their heads are going to explode, because it will be finally some inkling of like where Biden is heading with who he wants to make lifetime federal judges. It'll give you a sense of, okay, who did he pick? What's their backgrounds? Like, let's pick them apart. And there will be countless stories written about, like, who are these people and what does it mean for Biden's vision of the courts? People will read a lot into it, I think. And then I think the idea is they'll start moving pretty quickly, because not only is Biden aware of what the last 4 years were under Trump and how much of an effect that Trump and Mitch McConnell had on the courts, but he was also around when Obama was president. He was the vice president. And during the Obama years, Republicans actively, repeatedly obstructed Obama's judicial nominees at almost every step of the way that you can in a judicial nomination process. And that starts way before someone's even nominated. I mean, the whole judicial nomination process starts with senators recommending someone to the White House to fill a seat in their state. So if you are a Republican senator and you don't like Obama because he's just Obama, he's a black president, and you can't wrap your head around that, some of them simply did not recommend anyone to Obama to fill courts in their states. They would prefer to leave them empty for years sometimes and wait in the hope that a Republican president will come along. Then they can recommend someone to that president who is more ideologically aligned with them. So Biden was around for years of Republicans pulling pretty extreme measures to prevent Obama from filling court seats. And that's why Trump inherited so many, because they blocked Obama. So Biden was around for that. He's not going to, I think they learned their lesson. They were very willing to work with Republicans back then to fill seats, and it didn't work out for them. So here we are with Biden now. He's watched the last 4 years of Trump and Mitch McConnell just blanketing the courts with judges. And he remembers, I'm sure, back then when they couldn't get anybody through, even like totally non-controversial, bipartisan supported judicial nominees, they still wouldn't support them. I mean, Merrick Garland is sort of the classic example. I mean, he was a Supreme Court nominee, so that's the highest court. But that guy he is so moderate, and even the Republicans who wouldn't agree to give him a hearing couldn't help but say, he's a pretty good guy. Like, he'd probably be a great judge. We're just not going to give him a hearing because Obama. So all that builds up to this moment, and I don't think Biden is going to wait. And I think he might surprise people with how aggressive he actually is with this. So I think once he nominates his first batch of judges, I think that the White House is ready to go. And I think their senators ready to go with him because they know what happened before. And even though Biden's in office for for 4 years, on Capitol Hill, you kind of view things in 2-year increments, right, not 4, because currently the Democrats run the White House, the House, and the Senate. They run all of it. But that could easily and likely will change in 2022. So you've got this window that's shrinking, and it shrinks even more because people are running for office in 2022, and that takes away from time spent in Congress. So suddenly 4 years under Biden for getting judges through is shrunk down to a year and a half until everything is kind of derailed and gone off in different directions. So now is the time, I think, and they know this, that they've got to line up their nominees and just push them through because it could all change in the fall of 2022, and then they can't do it anymore. So I would say once they hit the ground, they're going to keep running.
Great place to stop. I really hope that we can have Jen back on once these names start dropping and all the ramming begins. I'm also really curious to come back sometime, maybe in a year or more, to talk about whatever comes of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Court Reform and what we're talking about when we talk about court reform, both administrative expansion or other ideas when the time comes. But for this week, that concludes Ask an Atheist. Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to everyone who's watching for joining us.
And be sure to check out FFRF's broadcast TV program, Free Thought Matters. This week, Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker speak with Malachi McCourt, an actor, author, radio host, and, well, let's let him explain it.
During the week, I'm an atheist, And on Sundays, I'm a pagan because I believe in everything. I believe in the sunshine. I believe in the moon, the beauty of clouds, stars. I believe in love. I love my wife, Diana. I love my children, all 9 of them, my 5 children, 9 grandchildren, a great-grandchild on the way. I have wonderful, loving friends. And the world is just full of love. That's all there is to it. And I don't need a God or any kind of deity to give me love.
All right, preach it, Malachi McCourt. You can watch Free Thought Matters on TV stations around the U.S. on Sunday mornings, or you can catch them on FFRF's YouTube and Facebook channels. Also, check out Free Thought Radio. That is FFRF's weekly radio show and podcasts. You can find that at ffrf.org/radio. And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check us out on the web at ffrf.org. We will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Thank you again, Jen, and goodbye.